Every time a nuclear accident was about to happen, someone from the future had traveled back in time and prevented it. What is a crazy history fact that sounds like a time traveler was involved in? One of H.G. Wells' short stories, a character is amazed that someone is able to place a smaller rectangular object into a receiver in their wall, and then watch a pre-recorded program on a screen. He basically described the VHS tape in the 1920s. If you learn about physics and when physicists had their theories or even prove them, then it feels like witchcraft. Like mostly everything was done in 1900, or even earlier, and we started to develop the ideas or even prove them 100 years later. A lot of them couldn't prove anything as they were limited by the technology of their time, but they still had theories that were proved very late or even late after their death. A man wrote a book about a boat called The Wreck of the Titan hitting an iceberg in the exact same area of sea as the Titanic, which was not very strong. The book was written almost 15 years before the sinking of the Titanic, and in the book, several things that actually happened with the Titanic happened to Titan, including going from New York to England, thought to be unsinkable because of its watertight compartments, traveled in excess of 22 knots before hitting the iceberg, didn't even have enough lifeboats for half of its 3,000 passengers, weighed 45,000 tons and was almost 900 feet long. A majority of the passengers died. It's tough for me to believe in time travel, but if I had to pick out one person in history who could have been a time traveler, I'd be hard-pressed to not pick Morgan Robertson, the author of Futility, or The Wreck of the Titan. Andrew Carlsen. He made many bids on high stocks and managed to get every single one right, raising his crony from 800,000 to several million. The SEC were alerted to this and had him arrested. Before he could be tried, he was mysteriously bailed and vanished without a trace. Since this news was given by a satirical newspaper in 2003, it wasn't taken seriously. Years later, it was found that indeed someone had made a lot of stock in 2003, but there is no known buyer on said individual. On September 26, 1983, the Soviet Union's missile attack early warning system suddenly displayed a high probability that an American intercontinental ballistic missile, ICBM, had been launched and was headed toward the Soviet Union. First, it was just one missile, but eventually the system reported that a total of 5 ICBMs had been launched. One man, Soviet Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov, had to make the decision whether to commence a retaliation by launching a counterattack, or to assume the detection was a false alarm. He, correctly, assumed it was a false alarm and did not report the warning. Had he chose to report it, World War III would have immediately begun, and who knows how that would have changed the course of history. You could say that this one man saved billions of lives, and all on a hunch. This is definitely one of those events where a time traveler or visitor from an alternate timeline could have been involved. Although Stanislav Petrov has never stated as such, that's to be expected to protect the identity and knowledge of the time traveler. The invention of the potato chip. There was a cook who was making French fried potatoes for a customer, and the customer kept sending them back, claiming that they were too thick. So eventually the frustrated cook peeled off thin slices of potato and fried those, apparently thinking, let's see him call these too thick, and it kind of took off from there. That customer sounds to me like someone who knows exactly what potato chips are, and wants to enjoy his favorite snack, but he's having a bit of trouble getting the cook at the local restaurant to get them right. Jules Verne's Paris in the 20th century sounds like an incel went back in time and just whined about the modern days. He complains about women working and having careers instead of just being wives. Talks about everyone just sitting around watching reality TV. Also describes the internet, drone warfare, the internal combustion engine, electronic music and a lot of other things not yet invented. The book was not published during his life as his publisher thought it was too depressing. Cleve Cartmill wrote a novel called Deadline in 1944, basically foreshadowing the development of the atomic bomb. This was too close to reality to be a coincidence, so the FBI visited him. He explained that the atomic theory was basic knowledge to the public to access, and he simply guessed the rest. After a while they went to leave. But as they opened the door he said, "Oh, and I know you're building the bomb in New Mexico." Shocked, they asked how he knew that. He explained that all of the top scientists off the field suddenly changed their address to New Mexico. The Indus Valley Civilization, contemporaries of ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, was far more advanced in several ways in comparison to them and most of history till a few centuries down the line. For example, They already had indoor washrooms with underground drainage systems, zoning and planning of cities in a uniform fashion akin to modern metropolises, extensive public works and social welfare, standardization of weights, measures, construction across the discovered area which is larger than Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. They were already at this stage when the Great Pyramids were built, indicating that they had been perfecting these techniques for some time. Their greatest achievements include sanitation, drainage, uniformity, social welfare and an apparently egalitarian society without ostentatious displays of power or religion like all other historical civilizations, all of which are centuries ahead of most other cultures. That one story of the guy who experienced an air raid 11 years before it occurred. Journalist J. Bernard Hutton and photographer Joachim Brandt were sent by a German newspaper to do a story on the Hamburg shipyard in 1932. It was an uneventful visit, until the bombs began raining down on them. Hutton and Brandt realized they were caught in the middle of an air raid and hightailed it out of there, but not before snapping some photographs. When they got back to the center of Hamburg, no one believed their story. They developed the photos they took, intending to prove to everyone that they weren't crazy. In fact, they proved the opposite. The photos showed no signs of an air raid. 11 years later, Hutton was living in London when he opened up a newspaper and probably nearly spit his coffee across his desk. There was a story about Operation Gomorrah, an air raid on Hamburg. The accompanying photos looked exactly like what he had experienced in 1932. Elon Musk. We live in a world where online payments are commonplace on the verge of universal. Just a single payment app in China processes over half of all financial transactions, online or off. But in 1999, when he founded the PayPal precursor that would get him acquired, that would have been near inconceivable. Electric cars and reusable rockets aren't quite as universal, but they've both gone from pie in the sky to viable commercial technologies in no small part thanks to his machinations. He's also got his fingers in brain-computer interfaces and various exotic transportation technologies, which would get huge if they do pan out. Is he just a dude with a good mind for engineering and without the sentimentality and vested interests that keep most industries doing it the way it's always been done? Probably. But he's been ahead of some pretty big curves, and all you people have been dead for a century anyway, what's it matter? This would go a long way toward explaining his callous disregard for human life. His being sent back to evangelize all this tech that we could achieve if we'd just get off our butts and do the work is a fun thought. During World War II, the Germans had an enciphering machine called Enigma. Gordon Welshman made a machine called the Bombay to decipher hidden messages. It worked great, but the Germans could just reformat their system using a different algorithm, making it necessary to spend a lot of time tweaking the deciphering equipment. So with incredible foresight, Allied statisticians figured out how much they could disrupt Nazi strategy using the machine without them finding out their code was broken. They were able to evacuate many strike zones from Nazi bombings, maneuver their forces to unoccupied territories, and sacrifice minimal assets to make the Nazis believe the strike was effective. The Peri Race map of 1513 shows the landmass of Antarctica without ice. I believe that Peri Race, aka the Turkish cartographer Hagi Ahmed Mahidin Piri, made his map having studied older maps. He stated that he had used 20 different maps and charts as his source documents. 8 of them were Ptolemaic maps, maps of the known world according to the 2nd century Hellenistic or Greek society. 4 were Portuguese maps, 1 was an Arabic map, and 1 was drawn by Christopher Columbus. Srinivasa Ramanujan, 1887–1920, was an Indian mathematician, who with almost no formal mathematical training worked in advanced mathematical areas, initially on his own and in isolation. His works were so advanced that are being proven even as late as 2012, and if I recall correctly he claimed that he was progressing in his work through visions revealed to him by Hindu gods in his sleep. He died at the age of 32. The stories of Jesus can be explained away by Jesus being a time traveler. Think about the miracles he did. Water to wine? He just added food coloring. Curing leprosy? That was his time traveler friends pretending to have leprosy for the crack. Anything we can do? You obviously can do it in the time that time travel was invented. When the Pilgrims from the Mayflower landed, the first person they met was a Native American named Samoset, who greeted them in English with "Hello, do you have any beer?" He had learned English from fishermen that came to the waters near there. I couldn't believe it when I first heard it. because school made it seem like the Mayflower was the US's equivalent of Columbus and they were the first Europeans to land in what is now America. But clearly there'd been interactions for a decent length of time before that. The RAF Raid on Lough during the Battle of Normandy, 1944. The Germans were organizing a counterattack with the goal of pushing the Allies back into the sea. Some historians say the Germans had a huge chance of success there. Only problem was, the officers were organizing the whole thing in a chateau at Lough. The RAF knew it and rocket-bombed the place into oblivion right before the order to attack was to be given out. Because of this, the German troops didn't get the order of attack and the operation was cancelled, thus saving the Normandy operations for the Allies as a whole. Intelligence here and huff duff there. It's quite convenient they happened to obliterate the exact building where everyone orchestrating the operation was at the exact same time. There was this man, Samuel Zemery, who migrated to Alabama from Russia in 1891. He started out his career buying bananas that were considered too ripe from a company that had big demand on the new banana market in the States. Long story short, he became more and more successful until the point where he became a giant in the fruit business, outcompeting even United Fruit. In 1912, entirely for personal purposes of expanding his banana empire, he was a key player in overthrowing the Honduran government, which happened so the United States could have economic control over the country and drain their wealth and resources. Zemery himself of course really benefited from this. I forgot the exact details though. Around 40 years later, he did the same thing, in the U.S. coup against Guatemala, when Guatemala tried to take back their own land that the U.S. had a banana plantation on. I read a book about Zemery, The Fish Who Ate the Whale, a few years ago. And more recently read Overthrow, a book on various coups orchestrated by the United States from 1890 to around 2000. So yeah, basically a random Russian kid showed up on the scene out of nowhere, kicked everyone's butt in the free market, and even effed over other countries so he could be the banana king. He was objectively a bad person, but I am floored by how damn efficient he was. Most nuclear accidents that were a near miss, both military and civil. It feels like every time an accident was about to happen, someone from the future had traveled back in time and prevented it. Every single time. Example, airplanes dropping nukes by mistake over the US, with 6 out of 7 failsafes failing except for one. Various reactors accidents that despite fatal, turned out to be not as bad as they could have, Chernobyl being an exception. Source of the accidents, Nuclear Accidents by J. Mahaffey, and others. Thanks for listening to Radio TTS. Hit the subscribe button and activate the notification bell for a free time machine. Click the right box for the Existential Crisis playlist. Let us know in the comments what you think about these claims.